My name's Jack. I come from a fractured family, brought up by an overbearing mother and her meddlesome sisters. Claire, the eldest, was 13 years older than me, and Lisa was 10 years my senior. I guess I was an unexpected addition, a child they seemed to blame for my parents' separation. My father walked out in 1977 when I was just 5, and I never saw him again. Growing up, I faced my fair share of bullying, both at school and at home. All I really wanted was my mother's love, just a simple sign of acceptance, but it never came. Despite the constant challenges, I worked hard and excelled academically, putting everything I had into my studies for 12 long years. By 1993, I found myself enrolled at Morton University in upstate New York, thankful for the chance to escape my old life. That's where I met Hannah. Her image is still crystal clear in my memory. She had an effortless beauty and a kind of confidence I had never seen. I, on the other hand, was reserved and always a bit awkward. Hannah was in her final year of a creative writing program, while I was just starting my master's degree in mechanical engineering. She was 5 feet 5 inches, with glossy brown hair and striking brown eyes. She seemed so far beyond my reach. The guys she attracted were the loud, confident types, the complete opposite of me. I was stunned when one of Hannah's friends started talking to me at a party, and even more surprised when Hannah eventually joined in. Although I had little experience with women, my modesty seemed to draw her in. I mustered up the nerve to ask her out, and we began dating. I'm not ashamed to admit she was my first in many ways. But about 6 months in, I started hearing rumors that she was seeing other men. I didn't know how to handle it. I had no proof, so I kept quiet. Hannah was used to getting her way. Her parents and her sister, Emily, had always spoiled her. She was self-centered and often made scenes in public, but I was in love for the first time, so I ignored the red flags. I didn't want to lose her, even though my friends advised me to end it. After graduation, we both found jobs and moved into an apartment outside of Portland, Maine. She wanted to stay close to her family, and I was indifferent since I'd severed ties with mine long ago. A year later, we got married, and shortly after that, our daughter Sophie was born. A couple of years later, Ava joined the family. Hannah seemed to relish being a mother, and for a while, things between us felt just right. Eventually, I made progress in my career and landed a job at Walker Engineering a decade ago. The increased salary and bonuses helped us save for a bigger house. But like many others, we faced challenges during the economic downturn of 2008. The competition for contracts was fierce, and I often worked long hours for no extra pay. It was during this time, while both girls were in school, that I discovered Hannah was having an affair with someone from our old university. I was so consumed with work that I didn't realize it until it was almost too late. Initially, I had no idea who she was seeing, but my friend Dan suspected it was an old classmate who'd moved nearby. When I confronted Hannah, she laughed at my suspicions, but I could tell something was off. Despite it all, I was in a good financial position, and Hannah kept pushing me to buy a house that matched our status. Eventually, I caved, and we bought a beautiful, detached 5-bedroom house in Portland. It was a buyer's market, so we got a decent price, though the mortgage was high. Around that time, I did something unusual for me. I opened a new savings account in my name only, depositing my share of the work bonuses into it. Since I managed all of our finances and was the sole breadwinner, Hannah likely didn't even know the account existed. Looking back, it was one of the best choices I made. I needed some form of security, especially since I wasn't sure if Hannah would leave me for her old flame. After that scare, things seemed to return to normal. My daughters became my focus. I made sure to support their education and spent every possible moment with them. Weekends were full of activities, dance lessons, concerts, trips to the zoo. Hannah, meanwhile, was often busy meeting her spoiled and idle friends. I rarely got to know their husbands, but it seemed we all shared similar situations, each of us under varying degrees of control by our wives. My friends would tease me with "Under My Thumb" by the Rolling Stones whenever I had to cancel plans to accommodate Hannah. Even my colleagues noticed my situation. At work, I heard the occasional remark about Hannah being in charge. A few months ago, everything came to a head. Ava had just left for university, and for the first time in 18 years, it was just Hannah and me at home. Both girls were attending Morton University, just like we had. As I helped Ava settle in with Sophie, she asked me a question that caught me off guard. "Dad, why are you still with Mom?" she asked quietly. I was stunned. Ava had always been the quieter one, more like me in that way. She then told me, her eyes welling up, "I heard she's seeing Henry Walker. Isn't he at your company?" Henry Walker, the nephew of the company's founder and someone I'd seen around for years. Hearing this from Ava was heartbreaking, but I wasn't entirely surprised. Over the years, I'd avoided digging into Hannah's affairs because I was terrified of tearing our family apart. I didn't want my daughters to look at me the way my sisters had looked at our dad after he left. So, I endured it, just to keep my family together. Ava's words shattered me. I realized just how deep her resentment toward her mother ran, far more than I'd imagined. It stirred up old memories of my own childhood, reminding me of my weaknesses. And there I was again, the subject of gossip at my own workplace, mocked by Henry. I felt truly lost, unsure how I could continue living like this, especially now that my youngest daughter knew about the betrayal that had come to define my life with Hannah. I knew I had to confront Hannah. My heart was pounding as I sat at the kitchen table, waiting for her to come home. When she finally walked through the door, I found myself unable to get any words out. She looked at me with an expression that seemed filled with nothing but apathy, maybe even a hint of contempt, as she started unpacking her shopping bags. Eventually, I found my voice. I asked Hannah about her relationship with another man. She didn't even try to deny it. Instead, she casually said she wouldn't call it an affair, insisting that it wasn't anything serious. I felt a mixture of shock and disgust, my heart sinking as I waited for some kind of explanation. Hannah said she admired me as a provider and a friend, but then she admitted there were needs I simply didn't meet. Her bluntness left me feeling hollow. I asked her outright if that meant she was cheating on me. Hannah didn't hesitate. She said it was just her body involved, not her heart or mind. I was stunned, unable to respond. Then, in an almost dismissive way, she said she had been exploring relationships with younger men. I couldn't help but raise my voice, asking her what she was thinking. She just told me to calm down, warning me not to shout. She admitted she had been seeing 2 other men, and then had the audacity to tell me that I needed to stay quiet about it. She warned me that if I didn't accept her terms, she'd leave and find someone else. I sat there, speechless, hoping she'd notice the pain on my face. She tried to justify her actions by saying that her friends were all doing the same, claiming that it could even make a marriage stronger. I was appalled. Using her friend's behavior to justify her own felt disgusting to me, selfish and shallow. I challenged her, asking how she'd feel if I found someone else. She laughed at that, mocking the idea of me being able to connect with another woman. She declared that our relationship would continue only on her terms, warning me not to mess up a good thing. And in some twisted way, she was right. For 22 years, I had been nothing but loyal, always complying with her every whim. Now, everyone seemed to know what was going on, and my reputation was in tatters among both friends and coworkers. The next morning, I walked into my office, and there was Luke Reynolds, the man Hannah had been seeing, waiting for me. With a smirk on his face, he asked how Hannah was doing, that smug grin making my blood boil. I chose to stay silent and walked over to the coffee machine. I could hear the laughter of some of my coworkers behind me, their amusement at my situation clear. Even Madison, the boss's secretary, seemed to be holding back a smirk. I made my way to my desk, trying to ignore it all, but I felt exposed, mocked both at work and at home. I tried to focus on my tasks, but anger kept bubbling under the surface. In my frustration, I started thinking about my father. I knew so little about him, only his birthplace and the fact that he had walked out on us when I was 5. I began searching family history websites, focusing on listings from Cambridgeshire, trying to find any trace of him. I narrowed down a few possibilities and posted inquiries on some genealogy forums. It gave me something else to focus on, something other than Hannah and Luke. While I was lost in my thoughts, my boss, Jack Walker, called me into his office. Jack was a successful but morally questionable man. I had considered quitting many times because of his behavior, but his persuasive nature and the high pay had always kept me there. Jack wasn't exactly discreet, and I knew he was having an affair with Madison, his secretary. His third wife knew nothing about it. He got straight to the point, mentioning that he had heard rumors about Hannah's infidelity. I snapped back, telling him it involved his own nephew. Jack just chuckled, shrugging it off as if it were some family trait to be unfaithful. After the uncomfortable exchange, Jack shifted the conversation to business. He talked about the importance of family, then warned me that if my personal issues affected my work, I'd have to leave the company. He said it in that patronizing tone, like a teacher scolding a disobedient child. I bit my lip, aware of Madison hovering by the office door, probably soaking up every word to spread to her friends. As I turned to leave, I found myself wondering why a young woman like her would get involved with someone like Jack, an older man with a tarnished reputation. Passing by Madison, I heard more quiet snickering. I lowered my head and walked away, and as soon as the door clicked shut behind me, I could hear laughter erupt from the office. It was clear they were laughing at my expense. Returning to my own office, I felt like I didn't even belong there anymore. It felt pointless. I had worked tirelessly, provided for my family, and paid for my daughter's education. Yet here I was, feeling like I was financing Hannah's betrayals. I've always been a simple man. I don't need much, just my gadgets, a few hobbies. Most of our money went towards Hannah's indulgences. I had never really questioned it until now, but it made me wonder, was I even happy anymore? My office, which had once been my sanctuary, a place where I felt creative and successful, now felt hollow. I had designed so many of the components that were being produced and sold, and I knew I could get another job if I wanted to. But they all saw me as weak, and maybe they weren't wrong. I wasn't someone who liked to stir things up. I had always been good old Jack, the quiet, submissive engineer. I looked at my computer, where a screensaver of our last family vacation played. I clicked on my email, and to my surprise, there was a message waiting for me from someone named Jennifer Holmes with the Cambridge Genealogy Committee. Shocked at the quick reply, I opened it and was amazed. Jennifer had read my inquiry about my dad and mentioned she had been in contact with a woman named Rachel Murray, someone claiming to be his niece, which made her my cousin. I responded immediately, providing my contact information and hoping to hear from Rachel soon. Leaving the office brought me a sense of relief, and when I got home, Hannah greeted me with a smile as she cooked dinner. Though I kept my distance at first, I eventually returned to the table for the meal. She looked at me and softly asked if we could talk about the previous night. I responded that there wasn't much left to discuss. She had already made her position clear. She almost sounded like she was pleading, pointing out my qualities as a husband and asking me not to deny her what she wanted. I pressed her about the betrayal, the humiliation, why she had done all this. Flustered, she shrugged, unable to give me any real answer. I was tired of her selfishness. I had worked long hours to meet all our financial needs and to give her the life she wanted, but in return, all I got was disrespect and ridicule. I even drove an old car so that she could have the newer one. She acknowledged that there were needs I wasn't fulfilling and gave me an ultimatum. Either accept things as they were, or she would keep seeking satisfaction from someone else. I finally snapped, mentioning Luke Reynolds by name, making it clear that everyone knew she was involved with him. She didn't deny it. She said it outright, that Luke was effectively my boss and would eventually inherit the company. She laid it all out. He provided what she needed in the bedroom, and if I couldn't accept it, she'd leave me for him. He would give her everything else she wanted. As usual, I said nothing. I simply got up and left the table, retreating to my study. Tears flowed down my face, and all I wanted was to be anywhere but here. Just then, the phone rang, and on the other end was an unfamiliar voice. It was Rachel. We spoke for about an hour, and by the end of the call, everything else seemed to fade into the background. I wore a genuine smile for the first time in a long while. Rachel was thrilled that I had decided to explore my father's past and had so much to share. She revealed that my mother had forced my father out of the house, something she had lied to me about throughout my childhood. My father had passed away in 1983 when I was just 11, succumbing to alcohol poisoning. My grandmother had always blamed my mother for his downward spiral. Rachel also told me that my father had wanted to reconnect with me after he left but had been prevented from doing so. We made plans to meet that weekend at her home in Cambridge, and I felt a sense of excitement. A change of scenery seemed like exactly what I needed. The rest of the week dragged by. At home, nothing changed, and at work, the ridicule only got worse. Luke and his buddies found it hilarious to hang a pair of underwear on my office door. As I passed by, I glanced at Madison, the secretary, but she kept her eyes down, not getting involved. Tucked into the underwear was a sticky note that read, "Please return to your wife." I was shattered. I sat down at my desk and cried. I wanted to blame everyone but myself. When Saturday finally arrived, I couldn't wait to leave. I told Hannah that I was going to visit a friend in London, and she barely reacted, indifferent to my plans. I had no doubt that my absence made things easier for her to continue whatever she was doing. The drive to Cambridge was stressful, and I arrived at Rachel's home an hour later than we had planned. But when I got there, she gave me the warmest hug I'd received in years, completely unfazed by my delay. I met her husband, Greg, and their children, Grace and William. They welcomed me in, and before long, we were deep into conversation about my father and the family I had never known. Rachel was kind and genuine, and her warmth was evident as she and Greg spoke, often finishing each other's sentences. It was clear they shared a deep connection. Later, we were joined by Rachel's brother, David, and his wife, Lucy. The day was filled with bonding and stories about my father. I learned more about the side of my family that had been kept from me for so long. After lunch, we took a brief outing to clear our minds, and when we returned, David and I got to talking about our jobs and families. Without really planning to, I found myself confiding in my cousins about my situation at home. They offered support and advised me not to put up with what I was dealing with. Leaving Cambridge that evening, I felt a renewed perspective. For years, I had put up with lies and mistreatment, but the honesty and warmth I received from my newfound family made me feel hopeful. I realized that I needed to find happiness again, not just for me, but for my daughters, my friends, and this family I had just discovered. I got home around 8 p.m., and there was Hannah, getting ready to go out. I asked her what her plans were, and she casually replied that she was meeting up with friends. Catching her off guard, I mentioned her other lover, Max. She looked startled for a moment, then pleaded with me to stop bringing it up, indifferent to how I felt. I urged Hannah to stop and be my wife again. She dismissed my concerns, insisting that she was and always would be my wife. She asked me not to deny her the pleasure she wanted, promising to keep things easy for me and assuring me she'd be back by midnight. She ignored my pleas, continuing to threaten me in her own way, even trying to embrace me as I turned away. Undeterred, she picked up her Prada handbag and headed for the door. Asserting myself as her husband, I firmly told her not to go through with her plans. She paused for a moment, looking at me as if she couldn't believe I had any authority. Then she burst out laughing, mocking me. She taunted me, saying I'd never have the courage to leave her, that I'd always be there at her beck and call. Crestfallen, I dropped my head. I realized I had been nothing but a fool, catering to her selfish whims while ignoring my own needs. I knew it was time to end this charade and make a change. I didn't waste any time. In fact, I started taking action while she was out with Luke, or maybe Max, or even both of them at the same time. That was probably what she meant by having it all. The thought of it fueled my anger, making it hard to concentrate. I needed to find a way to erase any lingering feelings I still had for her, and I think I figured out how to do it. I found an old box with a picture of my mom and my sisters, the only one I had of them. It was a photo that didn't hold much love for me anymore. I cut out a picture of Hannah's face and pasted it next to them. Adding her smirking face to the people I already felt no love for seemed like the right way to sever those last emotional ties. I placed the picture on my study desk, and around 12:45 a.m., I was done. By then, I had mostly devised my short-term plans, though executing them would probably take a few weeks. Luckily, I had time on my side. Hannah wasn't expecting anything from me. Even though I still had doubts and would need some help, I was finally convinced to go through with it. As I heard someone fumble with the front door, I peeked through the window and saw Luke Reynolds driving away. Hannah stumbled through the door and started up the stairs. I quickly cleared my browsing history, resolving to use incognito mode from then on. After she went to our bedroom, I made my way downstairs to brew some coffee. I sat there, thinking about my future, what life would be like away from this place, without her, and without my daughters. Surprisingly, I found it bearable. I made up my mind to move closer to my daughters once everything was settled. Monday morning, I headed to work determined not to give my all anymore. I was done caring about the remarks and laughter behind my back. I scheduled a bank meeting for 1 p.m., spending the morning reviewing my finances. It was a risk, but if everything worked out and with the right support, I'd be fine. The meeting went as planned, allowing me to close my savings account and remove my name from our joint account. I walked out with a tidy sum in hand, having converted the savings to cash. On my way back to the office, I made a stop at a tech store. I bought 2 digital voice recorders, a 500 gigabytes USB 3.0 hard drive, and a new PC hard drive. Back at work, I got started on accessing the company's private customer files. It took me about an hour to crack Jack's password, which, ironically, was just his wife's name and his birth date. With access secured, I downloaded all the critical files to the new drive, along with all my plans and designs for the energy-efficient hydraulic pump system I had developed. Our company produced pumps for air conditioning units, heavy machinery, and even for the dairy industry, and my designs were central to our success. After clearing my PC's history and removing all of my work and plans, I shut it down, swapped in the new hard drive, and reinstalled Windows. The rest of the day was spent looking up competitors and browsing engineering job listings around the South London area on Monster. That evening, I endured another quiet dinner before heading to my study. I found a job posting from a major competitor, one that had struggled during the financial crisis but seemed to be bouncing back. They were looking for a mechanical engineer to handle basic design and shop floor management. The position intrigued me. It wasn't exactly what I wanted, and the salary was £10,000 less than what I was making, but it was close enough. Without hesitating, I sent in my CV. To keep things normal with Hannah, I chose to sleep in our marital bed that night. I made sure I was already asleep when she came in. Her touch, even as she lay next to me, made me nauseous, but that feeling almost pleased me. I was growing repulsed by her, which, oddly enough, was something that could help me in the long run. The next day, I got a call from Robert Williams at Sutton Hydraulics. He sounded surprised that I was considering leaving Walker Engineering for his smaller firm. Though he seemed ready to hire me right away, I requested an interview for the next day, and he agreed. Another piece of the puzzle was falling into place, and things were moving quickly. I still had some time, so I began looking for apartments in the area. I eventually found one just 15 minutes from my daughters and only 5 minutes from Sutton Hydraulics. I scheduled a viewing for the day after my interview with Robert. Later that day, I informed Jack that I needed to visit my daughters in Kingston to sign some papers. He nodded casually, not giving it much thought. That night, I felt a strange sense of calm. Things were finally moving forward, and soon, I'd be free of all the pain Hannah had caused me. I called my longtime friend, Dan Brooks, and arranged to meet him and his wife, Emily, the following evening after my interview and the flat viewing. Dan and Emily, who could tell I had something serious on my mind, were eager to hear what was going on. Before meeting them, I decided to speak with my daughters about the situation. They were incredibly supportive and understanding, which gave me the extra courage I needed. That evening, at the gathering with Dan and Emily, I laid out the first part of my plan. They were more shocked by my determination to finally fight back than they were by Hannah's infidelity, which, in their view, seemed almost ordinary these days. Emily offered me another cup of tea and asked about my decision to leave Hannah. I explained the revelations from my meeting with my cousin Rachel, how my mother had forced my father out of the house, and how my sisters had taken her side. This time, though, I was grateful that my daughters were standing by me. Dan looked concerned, asking if my recent discoveries had been the trigger for finally standing up for myself. I explained that it had actually been a visit to my father's grave that solidified my decision. I had seen something on his headstone that shocked me and made me realize I needed to change my life. They both leaned in, curious. I explained that the gravestone had a carved rose, with the words, "In loving memory," followed by my father's birth date and the age he was when he died. Exactly the age I was now. Dan and Emily shared a look, a shiver of understanding passing between them. I explained that, faced with this realization, I had to make a choice. I could either continue down the same self-destructive path, falling into drinking or worse, as my grandmother had warned, or I could break the cycle. I chose to fight back. I continued, telling them that I would no longer sacrifice myself to be the perfect husband, nor would I endure Hannah's mistreatment and the humiliation any longer. I confessed how vulnerable I felt, how low I had sunk. Emily offered to help, and she suggested a plan to protect myself while also getting back at Hannah. I smiled, appreciating her strength, even though I had once doubted her loyalty. I went on to explain my financial preparations. Back in 2008, I had opened a separate savings account and put every bonus and bit of extra cash into it. The mortgage was also in my name only, making it much simpler for me to apply for anything independently. I outlined Dan's role in the next part of the plan, creating a new company to take over the house's mortgage, effectively transferring the ownership of the house through the land registry. Dan seemed skeptical but nodded as I explained it. I reassured him that Hannah wouldn't have any way to contest it. Her parents, being deeply religious, would likely turn their backs on her if they found out about her affairs, prioritizing their principles above supporting her actions. Dan and Emily eventually agreed to help, even offering to cover the mortgage temporarily if needed, which would allow me to delay payments. On my way back home, I made a stop at the local Land Rover dealership. There, I began negotiating to trade in Hannah's car for the latest model. We canceled the payment plan for her Range Rover Sport, which worked out well for the dealership, since they'd be able to resell it as nearly new. I assured the dealer that I'd be back for my own vehicle upgrade soon. They seemed more than willing to accommodate, especially since they'd be making a nice profit from the resale of Hannah's car. Before leaving, I picked up a 2016 brochure, not for myself, but for Hannah. When I got home, Hannah was in the lounge, sipping coffee, looking a bit pale. I took off my jacket and tossed my bag onto the floor, ready to put the next phase of my plan into action. I told her how much I loved her and wanted the best for her. Then I announced that I was going to trade in her car and get her a brand new 2017 model, pointing to it in the brochure. She lit up, excitedly exclaiming how much she loved the new car, completely unaware of my real intentions. She smiled, telling me how I always knew how to make her feel better. She mentioned a small hitch. Apparently, the dealership already had a buyer for her current car. She suggested that we take it over on Friday afternoon, proposing that I leave work early to do it. She even offered that I use her car for the weekend, hinting that it might be convenient for me to visit my lovers. I could see the shock register on her face when I made a sarcastic remark, casually mentioning her other lover, Max. She was clearly taken aback, and her expression shifted to one of confusion. I asked her if something was wrong, prompting her to address it. She brushed it off, but eventually asked if I was still upset about our arrangement. I clarified that it wasn't our arrangement, it was hers, and I had never agreed to it. I asked if I had any choice in all of this, really hoping for a different response this time. She just nodded, seeming to think she had reasserted her control over me. She even said she loved me, trying to sound sincere. But I couldn't bring myself to respond, and I walked into the kitchen instead. As I stepped outside into the back garden, my phone began to ring. It was Dan, confirming that the money transfer had gone through and that everything was set for the next day. Without wasting any time, I went straight to the bank in the morning. I was shown to the mortgage specialist's office, and within an hour, the mortgage was paid off, and I closed all of my remaining accounts. I walked out of that bank feeling lighter than I had in years. I walked a few doors down to a different bank and opened a new account. It gave me comfort knowing that I wouldn't have to pay another cent for the house unless Hannah decided to take me to court. The smile on my face faded the next day when I sat down to finalize the next steps. I contacted the land registry and completed the application online, filling out all the necessary information for Dan and Emily's newly formed company. Within 10 minutes, I received a confirmation email stating it would take 3 to 5 days to complete. Once it was finalized, I would simply hand over the property deeds to Dan, and he could register the house under his company's name. That same day, I went to Jack's office. Olivia was there with him, as she usually was on Fridays. Those were often the days he would spend some quality time with her, and I had no doubt I was interrupting something. Olivia slipped out, and I was left alone with Jack. I placed my resignation letter on his desk. Jack looked up at me, his usual smirk plastered across his face, and asked what the document was. I told him it was my resignation, and I said that it would be best if I left immediately given everything that had happened between our families. I suggested he probably didn't want me around much longer anyway. Jack seemed taken aback, completely blindsided by the news. I boldly requested that my exit paperwork, my P45, be ready by Monday and added that he shouldn't mention my departure to anyone, including Hannah. He tried to convince me to stay, sounding almost desperate as he pleaded that the company needed me. I countered by reminding him that they needed his nephew Luke more than they needed me. I informed him that I would return Monday to gather my remaining belongings. As I was about to leave, I pretended to drop a pin from my pocket. Bending down to pick it up, I used the moment to take a small digital recorder from my sock. Carefully, I constructed a makeshift pin out of it, hit record, and discreetly attached it under the seat into the wooden frame. Standing back up, I concluded our conversation, stating that I had other things to attend to, and turned to leave. As a parting shot, I told Jack not to come crawling back to me when his money ran out, suggesting that the only reason his cheating wife was still with him was because of his bank account. I smiled as I saw him stiffen, knowing I had hit a nerve, and walked out. An hour later, I drove home, picked up Hannah's car and its logbook, and headed to the dealership. John Reeves, the sales rep I had spoken with before, kindly offered to drive me home after the paperwork was done, and I gratefully accepted. When I got back that night, Hannah was sitting at the kitchen table, looking weary, with dark circles under her eyes. It was obvious she'd been crying. I asked her what had happened, and reluctantly, she admitted she had contracted gonorrhea. I couldn't help but laugh. I laughed hard, and she just glared at me, angry and embarrassed. She suggested we just take the medication so we could get back to normal, but the tension in the room was thick. Despite everything, that night was the first time in months that I slept well. The next morning, I slept in the spare room, feeling refreshed. A good night's sleep had done wonders for me. I went into our bedroom and gently woke Hannah, telling her that I was giving her space to rest and recover. Hannah looked at me, her eyes filled with tears, and said that she believed I found her disgusting. I remained silent. Tears started streaming down her cheeks as she admitted that she had messed up badly and that she still loved me. She said she wanted us to make things right. At first, I felt a pang of sympathy for her, but it vanished almost as quickly as it came. I realized at that moment that I no longer loved the woman I had been married to for over 21 years. Love, it seemed, could fade quickly after all. I walked out of the room without another word, got into my car, and drove off. That night, I stayed with Dan and Emily, who were hosting a dinner party with some friends and colleagues. It felt good to be surrounded by people who truly supported me. When I returned home late Sunday morning, I found Hannah up and doing chores. As I walked into the living room, she rushed over to me and hugged me. I just patted her back. Trying to sound cheerful, I suggested that we make arrangements to pick up her new car. I offered to drop her off in town to meet her sister, who could then take her to the dealership. I imagined her driving back in the new Range Rover, and she smiled, coming closer to me with her arms open. I turned back to the kettle, pretending not to notice. Throughout the day, Hannah was overly affectionate, which made me uncomfortable. She kept trying to kiss or hug me, and I kept finding excuses to leave the room. By bedtime, I noticed she had been crying again. I wished her good night, and she asked if I would sleep with her, saying she wanted to cuddle and hear me tell her everything would be okay. Feeling nothing, I responded that it wouldn't happen until she got an all clear from the doctor. I firmly told her that she had made her own choices, and now she had to live with them. Hannah's demeanor changed instantly. She shot back, saying that once she was better, she was sure she could find plenty of men who would be happy to be with her. She added that she had a lot of lost time to make up for. I couldn't help but chuckle. It had taken longer than I expected, but there it was, the harshness, the bitterness. It was all back. In the past, her tears might have broken me, but not this time. I ignored her crying and went to the spare room. It would be my last night in the house, and I would spend it in the spare room. I was relieved by what she had said. It confirmed what I had already suspected and erased any lingering doubts I might have had. As I lay down, I glanced at the altered photo of Hannah and my sisters. It seemed fitting that the last night I spent in this house was on my terms, no longer weighed down by all those years of regret. All I felt for Hannah at that point was hatred. She only acted sweet when she wanted something, and was nasty whenever things didn't go her way. I woke up early on Monday morning, and to my surprise, Hannah was already up and ready for her 8:30 hair appointment. As planned, I drove her into town. As I dropped her off, I couldn't help but think it might be the last time I ever saw her. I hoped it would be, but deep down, I feared it might not. On my way back, I called the phone company and terminated both of our contracts. I pulled into a lobby to pay the penalty fees on my card, and they told me the phones would stay active until 5 p.m., perfect timing. Next, I headed to the office to collect my P45. As I walked into the building, there was a noticeable tension in the air. Word of my departure seemed to have spread, and my colleagues looked uneasy, though I couldn't quite tell why. I made my way down the corridor to my office, passing by the coffee machine where the usual group of guys was gathered. I wondered if Luke and Max even knew they were both involved with Hannah. They grinned as they saw me approach, making jokes with each other. I greeted them with forced cheer, saying good morning. They asked about my wife, prompting the usual round of laughter at my expense, a joke I had never found amusing. I smiled and replied that Hannah wasn't doing too well, hinting that one of them might have given her an unwanted surprise. That shut them up pretty quickly. I glanced back as I walked away, seeing their jaws drop and chaos breaking out among them. I continued upstairs and saw Olivia sitting at her desk. She gave me a small, almost respectful smile, lowering her gaze as if she understood what was happening. Before I could even knock, Jack appeared at his office door. He snapped that he had what I wanted and told me to take it and leave. Perhaps that hint of respect I thought I saw was just in my imagination. I entered Jack's office and sat down, carefully slipping the digital recorder out of its hiding place beneath the chair and into my pocket. I knew Jack had had his usual Friday rendezvous with Olivia, and now I had it all recorded. Jack looked at me and asked if I had another job lined up. I ignored him at first, but eventually admitted that I didn't. A smirk played on his face. He likely assumed I'd come crawling back soon enough. I then asked about my final month's pay and the end-of-year bonus. He burst out laughing. Olivia walked in at that moment, holding my P45, and asked what was so funny. Jack explained that I had requested my bonus and pay, and they both laughed. I decided to join in, laughing loudly, and they both stared at me in confusion. Olivia asked why I was laughing, and I shot back, asking her why she let an old man take advantage of her every week. I laughed even harder, and they both froze. Olivia's eyes widened as Jack flushed with anger. Jack snapped, calling me a scoundrel, and told me to get out of his office and out of his company before he had someone drag me out. Still chuckling, I left the office and collected the last of my belongings. An hour later, I arrived back home. I unloaded the back seats, opened the trunk, and went into the house. I stood there for a moment, surveying the rooms, trying to decide what to take. I started with a few Romero Brito artworks, wrapping them carefully in plastic that I found in the garage, then loaded them into the car. I wandered around the house, collecting various items I thought were worth something. Upstairs, I emptied my wardrobe and gathered all the important paperwork from the safe. Birth certificates for my daughters, our marriage certificate, and anything else that seemed important. I used a ladder to access the loft, retrieving old belongings, including my degree and family photos. In the master bedroom, I took all of the jewelry I had bought for Hannah over the years, worth over 10,000 pounds. I also took all the handbags, shoes, and expensive coats I had given her. In fact, everything in the wardrobe was my acquisition, so I claimed it all. My meticulous record-keeping for insurance purposes was going to come in handy when I sold everything. After packing up most of what I wanted, I realized I would need a TV, so I took that, along with my movie collection and the Blu-ray player. The car was getting too full, so I decided to ditch all of Hannah's clothes and some other unnecessary items, including some of my old clothes. I'd need a new wardrobe anyway, and I knew my daughters would be more than happy to help me out with that. I gathered the best pictures of me and the girls and packed them in the car. There was no real rush. Hannah wouldn't be back until after 2 p.m., so I took a moment for a cup of tea. It felt like a necessity, like something written in the Magna Carta. I called the TV company and canceled our satellite service, then phoned the utilities to cancel the gas and water accounts. It would take a few days for everything to shut off, but I didn't care. Returning to the bedroom, I sat on the bed, glancing around one last time. That's when I noticed something that sparked an idea, one that even scared me a little. Hannah's wedding dress was still sitting at the top of the wardrobe in a dusty old box. She had always loved that wedding dress, probably more than she had ever loved me. I took it down and found our wedding album among the box of old photos stacked on the bed. I grabbed the duvet cover and bundled everything together before heading out to the garden. I dumped it all into a pile, including Hannah's clothes and other things I couldn't sell. I decided to leave her underwear untouched. I didn't want any memories of that kind lying around. After closing up the car, I checked the time. Only 1:45 p.m. I called up Robert Williams, telling him I'd be dropping off my P45 later with the night shift. He seemed happy to hear from me, eager to get started fresh the next day, and I hoped that maybe I had brightened his day. At precisely 2 p.m., I sat waiting for the call. In the meantime, I found some paint thinner in the garage and poured it over the wedding dress out in the garden. As I was about to light the fire, my phone rang. I answered, and sure enough, it was Hannah. Her voice came through, demanding to know what was going on. I replied sarcastically, asking her what she meant. She insisted that I shouldn't play dumb. I asked her to calm down and explain what was happening. There was a moment of silence, and I could hear her heavy breathing, along with what sounded like her sister, Jennifer, in the background. Hannah said that someone had told her I hadn't bought her a new car but had sold hers instead. Feigning innocence, I replied, teasingly mentioning that I must have forgotten to tell her that detail. She began to sound more panicked, asking again what was going on. Keeping calm, despite my racing heart, I told her that if she wanted a car from now on, she could pay for it herself. She shouted in response, her voice a mix of anger and confusion. I repeated that she'd heard me just fine and added that I needed to finish tidying up the kitchen. She asked if this was some kind of twisted joke, but I remained silent. She screamed that we would talk about it when she got home, furious at what she thought was a prank. I didn't respond. I hung up in the middle of her yelling my name. Then I stepped outside, struck a match, and lit the pile on fire. Our past went up in flames as I walked away. I reached into my pocket, took out our marriage certificate, tore it into pieces, and left the shredded remains on the kitchen table beside a lone photograph of us at Disneyland, capturing what once had been happier times. I wondered if she ever thought about those days with any fondness. Sliding into my car, I drove off. As I reached the end of the street, I caught a glimpse of Hannah and Jennifer in my rearview mirror, rushing into the house without looking up. With a smile, I powered off my phone and drove away. By 4 p.m., I had made it to Sutton. Since I had some time, I stopped by a nearby phone shop to set up a new mobile contract. I then headed to the office, catching the admin team just in time to finalize my paperwork. I also met Freya, my new secretary. Unlike Olivia, she exuded professionalism despite being young, which was a welcome change. Returning to my empty flat, I brewed a cup of tea with the kettle I had borrowed from home. After unpacking, I ordered pizza for dinner. When I checked my old phone, it was finally disconnected, and I smirked, knowing that Hannah was now without a phone too. It felt good to know the girls would have some peace before I inevitably reached out. I set up my sleeping bag in the lounge. Furniture wouldn't be arriving until the weekend, but for now, I relished the distance from Hannah. Switching on my laptop, I reviewed the recordings I had from Jack Walker's office. His affair with Olivia was crystal clear on those tapes. I uploaded the evidence and made several copies on USB sticks, addressing them to Jack's wife, Margaret, and to Olivia's boyfriend, Peter. I planned to mail them out first thing in the morning. Finally, I called my daughter Sophie to let her know I was safe and updated her on my plans. I cautioned her not to let her mother know where I was, and she assured me that Hannah hadn't been able to reach her yet, thanks to the disconnected phones. Over the following week, I focused on furnishing my new flat. I also began diverting some clients from Walker Engineering to Sutton Hydraulics. Though a few remained loyal to Jack, most preferred what we had to offer, which meant Walker Engineering began losing a considerable amount of business. I knew Jack would eventually realize why his company was struggling, but frankly, I didn't care. With the utilities at my old home disconnected, Hannah would finally understand that I wasn't coming back. She would be left to deal with the growing pile of bills. Dan started the process of selling the house, backed by Emily's enthusiasm. By the end of the week, There were signs up on the property. During this time, I received word from AA, my father's cousin who I had recently been in touch with, that Hannah had moved back in with her parents. Apparently, there was a lot of tension at her parents' house due to their disapproval of her infidelity, and she was seething with anger toward me. It felt oddly satisfying to know that she was facing consequences for her actions, though I knew the saga wasn't over yet. By the weekend, Dan and Emily hosted another dinner party, a chance for me to relax and step away from all the drama of my escape plan. Then on Sunday, I received some promising news. After just a week on the market, there were 2 serious offers on the house for £550,000. I accepted one of them immediately, thrilled to move forward. I began preparing for the next steps, focusing on securing my daughter's futures and making sure my investments were sound. I also set things up to ensure Dan would be compensated, and I kept a portion in cash for my own security. Being prepared was my top priority. Later that week, Dan let me know that the sale of the house could proceed quickly, and I felt a sense of freedom that I hadn't felt in years. I quickly contacted a removal company to clear out what was left of my old house. Meanwhile, the girls reached out to their mother, who responded with more anger and threats than I'd anticipated, assuring them that this turmoil would soon end. I did my best to comfort them. On Tuesday morning, during a conversation with a new client, one who had just met with Jack Walker to discuss a possible contract renewal, I learned how dire things were at Walker Engineering. The client revealed that, due to a major loss of projects, Jack's company had to lay off half of their staff. He also mentioned that Mrs. Walker had filed for divorce, citing Jack's infidelity. Despite hearing this, I felt nothing for Jack. No sympathy, no sadness. My mind was too busy focusing on calculating upcoming commissions. I had no idea what had become of Olivia and her boyfriend, but I knew that he had received my gift, and it was clear why Jack's marriage was crumbling. I found myself wondering what Mrs. Walker's friends and family thought of her affair with an older man like Jack. For my efforts at Sutton Hydraulics, I was rewarded with a brand new Land Rover Discovery HSSE. I had considered treating myself to something similar before, but Robert and the rest of the executive team were so thrilled with my contributions and the company's new direction that they gifted me the car, along with a commission check of over £30,000. As I stood by my office window, gazing at my new car, I was startled to see a familiar Ford Focus pull into the parking lot. The car belonged to Hannah. Knowing this was bound to happen sooner or later, I braced myself for a confrontation. Just then, my office phone rang, and my secretary, Freya, informed me that a woman claiming to be my wife was waiting in reception. I told Freya to inform her that I was in a meeting and wouldn't be available for another hour. 3 hours later, I glanced out the window, and there she was, still waiting. With a sigh, I decided it was time to leave for the day, prepared to confront her if necessary or simply drive away if she didn't see me. I exited through a side door, headed towards my car, and was about to get in when I heard the screech of tires. Before I knew it, Hannah had pulled her car up, blocking me in. She stepped out, storming towards me, her face filled with fury. She looked disheveled, dressed in worn-out clothes that probably belonged to her sister, with her hair a tangled mess. "You damn fool!" she screamed, taking a wild swing at me but missing. I could feel her rage radiating as she demanded an explanation. I tried to calm her down, inviting her to sit in my car with me. She seemed surprised by the new car, and after taking a look around, she began talking about her financial struggles, pleading for me to return. I replied that since I couldn't fulfill her needs or compare to her younger lovers, I felt redundant in her life. She then begged me to come home, saying we could move past everything and she was willing to forgive me. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I asked if she was joking. She said no, that she truly forgave me for everything, for selling her things and for wrecking her life. I couldn't help but laugh at her. I questioned how she could claim to forgive me when she was the one who had openly cheated and disrespected me. I told her plainly that I would never take her back and suggested she go to one of her lovers instead. She looked down, her voice softer now, and admitted that her friends were treating her differently now that we had separated. She said that some of their husbands had even started questioning their own wives' fidelity. While I did feel a small pang of sympathy, I knew I couldn't let that sway me. She admitted that she had thrown away a good life, and that her actions had led to this mess. But I had to move forward. Hannah pleaded, saying she had nothing left and needed me. She mentioned wanting a share of the house and asked about getting a divorce. I pointed out that not once during this whole ordeal had she said she loved me. All she said was that she needed me, but I didn't need her. I then told her that I had defaulted on the mortgage and lost the house, admitting that I had lied about the situation. Her face showed pure shock, and it was clear to me then that her visit was primarily about money. I told her I wanted a divorce. She began to cry, claiming that after more than 20 years together, she still loved me and wanted to make things right. I shook my head. I emphasized that her betrayal was too big to forgive, and I would never come back. Her cries grew louder, filling the car. To end it, I offered her a clean break, £30,000 in cash if she agreed to proceed with the divorce quietly. Her demeanor shifted instantly. She yelled at me, threatening to fight for everything in court, claiming that I hadn't really lost the house. She called me smart, too smart for that kind of mistake. I looked her in the eye and told her that she wouldn't get a penny from me if it went to court. She stepped up to me, and I explained that I'd fight her every step of the way. I made it clear that she had no money, and I would move my assets around, making it impossible for her to track them down. By the time her lawyer found anything, the fees would wipe out any gains. I gave her a choice: take the money or face a long, costly legal battle. Never breaking eye contact, she yelled that she still loved me, accusing me of mistreating her. She kept saying that because of her, our daughters would thrive and that they would grow up to be better than either of us. I told her to take the money and get out of my life. After a moment of silence, she finally agreed, saying she'd take the money and go ahead with the divorce. I nodded, saying I'd arrange it, and she stepped out of my car, slamming the door behind her. Moments later, she sped off. The following day, I initiated divorce proceedings, citing infidelity as the reason. A week later, I arranged to meet Hannah at the girl's apartment. Even though the sale of the house had been finalized, I held off on investing the proceeds until the papers were signed. Keeping things civil in front of Sophie and Ava was tough, but I managed. I handed Hannah the cash, and she signed the divorce papers without much fuss. After saying goodbye to the girls and wishing Hannah well, I prepared to leave. Hannah suddenly burst into tears, though I couldn't tell if they were genuine or just for show in front of the girls. Sophie and Ava exchanged knowing glances. Ava mentioned seeing me next weekend for the Coldplay concert they were excited about. I returned to the room briefly, where Hannah continued sobbing, unnoticed by the others. Suddenly, I realized what Ava was implying about the concert. Sophie asked me about our plans, and I mentioned I'd check with Amy and let them know during the week. Then, I turned and left the apartment, ignoring Hannah's desperate cries. As I walked out, I closed the door behind me, feeling a sense of closure, as if a long and painful chapter of my life had finally ended.